Happy Halloween. Leave now while you still can.
Leave now before Master finds you.
Who is that knocking at my door? Who is that knocking at my door? Who is that knocking at my door? Be gone with you.
Hello everyone, today's video I'll be talking about the legendary George Romero's Zombies Living Dead series. In this video I'll be talking about George Romero's movie that starred the flesh-eating zombie movie, Night of the Living Dead from 1968. Before we dive into this review, I have a little confession to make. As a horror fan, I'm not really big on zombie movies, not because I'm bothered with gore and splattered body parts, but George Romero's is one exception for me. He has great stories, character arc, social commentaries, themes on racism, gender, a little bit of religion, but not to the extreme. Also, in each video I will talk briefly on the remakes, just briefly. I won't have time to do a separate video on the Romero Living Dead remakes. They're not bad movies by all means. I just don't have the time for the moment to do a video on George Romero's Dead Zombie remakes. To me, sometimes zombie movies can be cliche, repeat themselves, on the end of the world getting boring sometimes. But there are some good zombie movies that are exceptions for me. These are one of them. This franchise is an anthology horror series. You don't need to watch any of these movies in any order. Every movie is different. This movie was the first flesh-eating zombie movie, which was very revolutionary at the time. Prior to this, zombie movies were on voodoo, religion, slaves, and mind controlling. Like, for example, I Walked with a Zombie, White Zombie are examples of this. This is the first zombie movie where when you get bitten you turn into a zombie. It was also the start of the plague zombies. We don't know what caused this pandemic. No explanation. Why are the dead coming back? That's what makes it scary. Even though they are zombies, they are never referred to as zombies. In this movie they are called ghouls instead. It was interesting to read how Romero did the zombie gore special effects using Bosco chocolate syrup mixed with red ink. Then again, this movie was also shot in black and white. This is considered by many horror fans to be the last black and white horror movie for its time. This movie came out in 1968. It came out at the same time when there were a lot of crazy world events happening around this time period. Like, for example, you had the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of the late President John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated 5 years prior. Segregation, civil rights, African Americans fighting for equal rights, wanting to be treated equally to end segregation. No more whites only, blacks could eat in the same restaurant or drink out of the same water fountain. Teenagers and college students were protesting the Vietnam War, thinking that it was wrong at the time. It was also a response to how people were so paranoid at the time when this movie came out. The scene when Ben and the others are watching the news on television, it feels like so realistic, but done in a fictionalized way. George Romero and producer John Russo have cameos on that TV news footage. It was done in one take, and they had no permit for that scene. From doing research on this movie, people pointed out this is a survival of the fittest movie, how that race, gender, ethnicity, political, and religious beliefs do not matter at this point. That all goes out the window during a zombie apocalypse. It's about trying to put differences aside, work together as a team, have good communication, but sadly that does not happen in this movie. In the movie you have these characters who are trapped in a house in the middle of nowhere. They don't like each other, they don't agree on everything, they can't learn to put their differences aside and learn to work together as a team to survive. Ego, power, and lack of communication got in the way of these characters for not surviving. Everyone wanted to be in charge. Everyone wanted power, control over the situation. People think they had the answers to everything, they were right and not wrong. It should have been, wow, why didn't I think of that plan? Better than my original idea. Also, this is a movie where you look at everyone's different point of views. I think sometimes the characters were right and wrong sometimes, and didn't always make the best decision without realizing it. This movie shows that the characters learn to put their differences aside and work together. They could have survived, but sadly that's not the case right here. The lack of communication makes me think about that episode of The Twilight Zone, The Shelter. There's a scene in this movie where Ben says a great line to Harry Cooper that, "You're the boss downstairs and I'm the boss upstairs." That basically meant Ben was in charge, but again, no one should be the boss or in charge. Put your differences aside and learn to work together as a team. Ben, played by Dwayne Jones, this is the first time an African-American actor was the lead role in a hero in a horror movie. That was very revolutionary at the time to have a black actor to be the hero in a horror movie. He does a great job in this movie, Dwayne Jones. Despite Dwayne Jones being the star of this movie, he wasn't a big A-list actor. He only did a few movies, and he was mostly known for being a theater actor. George Romero said that when they had actors audition for the role of Ben, he said Dwayne Jones' audition was the best, and decided to rewrite the character Ben as a black character. Dwayne Jones said in interviews he never saw Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, and other George Romero's films. He wasn't interested in seeing the other Romero zombie movies. Despite this movie's big cult following, Dwayne Jones said that he got tired of talking about Night of the Living Dead after so many years. When you think about it, this movie came out in 1968. At the beginning of the next decade, blaxploitation movies came to be big and popular in cinema at the time in the 70s. In the past for cinema, black actors were not big stars. They were portrayed as stereotypes, only playing butlers, shoe shiners, janitors. Sidney Poitier broke that and was the first lead black actor star in cinema. He was like the Jackie Robinson of Hollywood when you think about it. The character Barb is a damsel in distress and shocked after her brother was killed right in front of her with a zombie. Not a bad character, she's not well developed. You do feel bad for her seeing her brother get killed right in front of her eyes. This was Judith O'Dea's film debut. It has a great opening shot of Barbara and her brother Johnny driving to the cemetery on a Sunday, visiting their deceased mother, and how Johnny does not go to church. People think praying is only for church, which is not true. People don't realize how praying can be done anywhere, no matter what. It's also a great opening of good dialogue grabbing to get our attention. Johnny's complaining about the long drive. When Barbara prays on her parents' tombstone, Johnny comments, "Praying's for church." Barbara responds, "Haven't seen you in church in a long time." People have this notion thinking that praying is only for church, which is not true. People can pray anywhere, anytime. Some people have seen this dialogue as a response to the time when Time magazine wrote the article, "Is God Dead?" which was shown in Rosemary's Baby, another groundbreaking horror movie that came out the same year as this movie. Also, this scene has been looked at as how we fear when we all die, we are forgotten. This part of the movie is a little bit of social commentary at the time how religion was being questioned and looked down upon for people. But Romero does not go too much deep into detail on religion in this movie. Her brother Johnny was kind of a bit of a jerk when they spot a Walking Dead zombie. For a small part, Johnny has one of the most memorable iconic lines in horror film history. "They're coming to get you, Barbara." Before I saw this movie, I knew about that iconic line from hearing about it from Halloween 2. To Johnny's credit, he does save his sister Barbara. People pointed out how Barbara is one of the weak characters of the movie. I can see why. At the same time, this character is fine just the way she is. She was in shell shock seeing her brother get killed by the zombie right in front of her eyes. The scene where she's freaking out after telling Ben what happened, how she ended up there. Ben hit her, which was a misunderstanding. Dwayne Jones said that it was hard for him to do that scene, feeling bad when he hit Judith O'Dea, even though it was only just acting. He was not doing it on purpose. Dwayne feared because of what the audiences would think at that time, because of what was going on around that time in history. Also, seeing her out of the house in the middle of nowhere, when she's looking around, she finds that dead zombie corpse. That was scary. And the music box, with all that's going wrong with no answers, it's like she's trying to escape into her own world for a few minutes. When she knows that she has to come back to reality and face the fact that something is wrong, that something's not right. I do agree with Ben, despite Barbara still wanting to believe and maybe go out and find her brother Johnny, thinking that he might still be alive. But sadly at this point, he was dead. I read that Judith O'Dea hates horror movies, and that House of Wax with Vincent Price scared her. I also read how that Judith O'Dea is amazed and surprised how this movie's had a big impact on culture, and still surprised how this movie is still being talked about to this day. The zombie Bill Hindman for the opening scene, he's a very iconic zombie. People said he looked almost identical to Boris Karloff. He even said that he mimicked, Boris Karloff's Frankenstein walk. Harry Cooper's the antagonist of this movie. He's a real asshole. He can be pointed out as a villain of the movie, but it's strange how two-dimensional he is. But again, his character had his points and somewhat okay ideas. At the same time, he was still a jerk and had a big ego. He didn't care about Ben. His daughter's bitten by one of the zombies, and he's scared and afraid of his daughter turning into a zombie because her humanity will be lost. We don't know how, or it's not mentioned how Harry and his wife's marriage seemed like it was a mess and falling apart. The zombie apocalypse made things worse, and not say their marriage, that's for sure. Crazy how despite playing a racist jerk in real life, Carl Hartman liked Dwayne Jones. When Dwayne Jones died, when he found out, he was very depressed over his death. Not only does Carl Hartman play Harry Cooper, the villain of this movie, he plays the radio news announcer when Barbara and Johnny were in the car and was one of the producers of this movie. A little bit jack of all trades for this movie when you think about it. The racial commentary in this movie is seeing how a white man and a black man just could not work together, not solve problems together. No one admits who's right or wrong, or that person was right, they made a mistake. The part when Helen Starr becomes a zombie and kills her with a gardening tool was terrifying and creepy. People point out this scene as a symbolism of what was going on in 1968. The rebellion of kids against their parents because of the hippie movement, anti-war movement, the youth fighting back against their elders. But again, I'm not sure if I see it that way, but it's an interesting different point of view from other people's perspectives. The characters Tom and Judy are not bad characters. There's really not much I have to say about them. These are like minor characters with not much arc or personality. They're basically boyfriend and girlfriend that were at the lake about to go for a swim until they heard the news radio on zombies attacking and they went running. I was into the actor who played Tom, Keith Wayne. This was his only movie. In the 1970s, he had a music career, but after that he was a chiropractor for most of his life until he died in 1995. Judith Ridley had no acting experience prior to this movie. She was a secretary for Carl Holdman. The music is very good, despite that it's only stock public domain music that was borrowed from the Capitol EMI Records High Q stock music library. Because of the movie being a low-budget film, they didn't have the money to create their own music, so George Romero just borrowed random public domain music. But somehow the music he used for this movie works very well. When I first saw this movie, it shocked me when Ben does not survive and he was shot. Not saying this might have been the first time a horror movie did this, but for me, this was the first time I saw a horror movie where none of the characters survived a horror movie. This made it have to be one of the most shocking endings I ever saw in a horror movie. Most of the time I've always watched horror movies, there's always characters that live, dies, but that's not the case right here in this movie. A lot of people debate on the internet that Ben was shot by these hunters because he was black, or there was a misunderstanding, they thought he was a zombie. It's hard to say. It seems to be like there's no answer to this debate. That's up to your decision, point of view, how you interpret it. This movie's been pointed out that George Romero had inspiration from Richard Matheson's I Am Legend. There was a Vincent Price movie 4 years prior to this called The Last Man on Earth, based on the Richard Matheson novel I Am Legend. And Herc Harvey's public domain horror movie Carnival of Souls from 1962. From watching all these movies, I can see why this has been pointed out as inspirations for this movie. These movies are different. Last Man on Earth was based on a novel by Richard Matheson. Neville faces off against vampires. And in Carnival of Souls was a dreamlike nightmare you wanted to wake up from, where death is chasing up to the main character as you can't escape death. The zombies she runs away from are not flesh-eating. They are basically Grim Reapers who are trying to pull her into the afterlife. But you also see where George Romero got the inspiration for his zombie looks from Last Man on Earth and Carnival of Souls. Zombies says it all. You can also make the argument that this could be a semi-remake to Last Man on Earth, but honestly, I don't see it that way. The way I see it, George Romero took the same concept as I Am Legend and made up his own version of that story. It was also a tribute to a novel that had an impact on him as an artist. And according to my friend Christian, Richard Matheson was not a fan of George Romero's Night of the Living Dead. With this movie being a low-budget movie, this was not a big movie with big A-list Hollywood names, Some of these were just regular people who just wanted to make a movie. These actors would work their regular day jobs and film this movie at night when they got off from work. I read that when this movie was being made and when filming wrapped up, George Romero had scenes that were cut from the movie that were stored. I'm not sure exactly what location. There was a fire accident. Those scenes are considered lost today. When going back to rewatch this movie, you notice the cut scenes. Too bad those scenes are lost. It was not for that fire explosion. Who knows what kind of director's cut this movie could have turned out to be. I've read about it when this movie was celebrating its 30th anniversary. They re-released it with some director's cut that was re-edited and restored. I never saw it, but from what I've heard from other people, they said the restoration was bad. They added new music, new characters. One character was a priest. Sounds like a mess of restoration. From what I've heard, I'm not sure if I'll check it out for curiosity. Here's a little personal story right here. Back in 2018, I was a boom operator for a small minor indie film called The Rest of My Life. One of the actors I worked with, her name was Mizan Kirby. When we had in between 5-minute breaks, she asked me personal questions about myself, about my plans, goals, hobbies, interests, and telling her the time that I was going to school at the time at Suffolk County Community College. I told her that I was a film buff, and I was president of a horror and sci-fi club at the time of my old college. She asked me if I ever seen Night of the Living Dead, and I said yes I did. She told me that she knew Dwayne Jones and was a student of his. Before Dwayne Jones died, he was an acting teacher, teaching classes at Westbury College on Long Island. I asked her what was he like, and she told me that he was a very nice guy, an encouraging person. I've heard stories on how when he was an acting teacher at Westbury College on Long Island, he rarely brought up to his students that he was Ben in Night of the Living Dead. And here's like one story I heard that supposedly that one time he was having lunch at a diner, and they showed Night of the Living Dead on TV, and his students spotted him, the movie being surprised that he was in Night of the Living Dead, and they were surprised that he never told them. Mizan Kirby also told me how originally Night of the Living Dead was going to be distributed by a film studio. The label fell off, and that's how Night of the Living Dead ended up being in the public domain. She also asked me if I saw Ganja and Hess, which unfortunately I still have not seen to this day, but I've heard about the movie. It was another one of Dwayne Jones's movies post Night of the Living Dead. And just recently, the actress Marlene Clark to this movie passed away recently. Another personal story about the first time I saw this movie back in my old college. In 2015, at a movie night the school had, it was my first exposure to Romero's zombie films. I had heard about them before, but I'd never seen them until 2015, when I was 22 at the time. The history of this movie amazed and fascinated me how this is a groundbreaking horror movie for its time back in the 1960s. Also how it was a low-budget horror movie that became a cult classic in recent years. For you Walking Dead fans, it was not for this movie, you would not have the Walking Dead comic books, TV show, today thanks to George Romero. Besides The Walking Dead, you would not have movies like 28 Days Later, Resident Evil, and Shaun of the Dead. An important horror movie for horror movie history, very groundbreaking, inspiring for the future of what was to come in horror movies in the next decade. For a low-budget film, it's still amazing and impressive how Romero was able to pull it off what he had to make a low-budget zombie horror movie with limited resources. It's still one of the best zombie movies ever made in horror film history. In retrospect for this video, here's a little brief review on the 1990 Night of the Living Dead remake. I finally saw this movie for the first time this year in preparation for this video. Well, it's not one of the best horror remakes, but honestly, it was not as bad as I thought it would be. It amps up the gore a little bit in this movie. It was shot in color. This was not 1968. No one in 1990 didn't want to watch the remake in black and white. Barbara kicks a little ass, not a damsel in distress or a stereotype. She's definitely well written better in this movie than she was in the original. Tony Todd did a good job as Ben, good casting choice. I told him that when I met him in 2016, if him would be a good casting choice as Ben for the Night of the Living Dead remake. Because this was a remake and a change-up, Ben ends up dying because he really was a zombie this time. Unlike in the original, it's a debate on the hunters shooting Ben because Either he was black or a misunderstanding, thinking that he was a zombie. But Ben's death was such a tragic, like in the original in this movie. Harry Cooper is still a jerk and an asshole like in the original. Not much of a change-up on his character. Let's just say I'm glad Barbara shot him in the end, thinking it was not fair that Ben died and he survived. And he didn't deserve to survive. It was directed by makeup special effect artist Tom Savini. Originally, he was supposed to work on the original Night of the Living Dead with George Romero, but because he was drafted and fought in the Vietnam War, he did not work on that movie. Who knows how the zombies would have looked with Tom Savini's special effects in the original Night of the Living Dead. But then again, what Tom Savini saw in Vietnam was more horrific than Night of the Living Dead. This movie is set in the 80s, not in the 60s, despite it doesn't really have that 80s feel to it. While not perfect, it does not top the original, it was okay. As a preference, I still prefer the original Night of the Living Dead. It's a solid okay remake. In 2006, there was a remake in 3D with Sid Haig. I've only heard about this movie, but I've never seen this one, so no comment. As much as I respect Sid Haig, I'm not sure I'll ever bother to watch this movie.
For some honorable mentions, there was an animated film called Night Animated of the Dead. I've never seen this movie, so no comment on it, sorry. There was a British version of this movie called Night of the Living Dead Resurrection, directed by James Plum. Again, never saw it, no comment. This will come as a surprise and a shock when I say this. There have been Night of the Living Dead musicals, but not necessarily Broadway. I'm not sure about who's done musical versions of Night of the Living Dead, whether it's done from college or high school, so no knowledge on this one. The Soska sisters are making their direct-to-sequel to Night of the Living Dead called Festival of the Living Dead, which is supposed to be released on Tubi sometime in 2023. I'll admit, I've never seen any of the Soska sisters' work, but I've seen them at conventions a few times.
That was my review of Night of the Living Dead. Tomorrow we're going to the mall for Dawn of the Dead. See you tomorrow.